I'm just greedy,
Yeah,
to go
yeah,
back in
yeah.
the past. I think my first answer will be to go back to 1800 BCE, be living next to a port city somewhere in Gujarat when the Harappan civilization or the Indus Saraswati civilization was at its peak.
The Chausat Yogini, I've read a little bit about them, and I just feel from whatever I know that it must be one of India's best kept secrets.
It is such a, tightly held philosophy
Right.
that if you tell an uninitiated person the secrets of this, you'll be punished by the yoginis.
Mhm.
And why? It's not because there's something bad happening here. There's something very delicate and very powerful happening here.
On the one hand, we are so contemporary, we are so uber modern in our minds, but at the same time, we're very connected. Many of us are very connected to our past.
We are very complex. Our philosophies, our religions that inform our culture as well, that inform our food, inform our habits, are very, very, very deep.
The Iconic Women podcast is a platform where we've come together to tell the authentic stories of women. These are women from different geographies, different eras in our history, as well as contemporary women today. We're going to continue to bring you great stories from women across India. If you like our content, don't forget to subscribe and to hit the bell icon for all further updates. And please don't forget to like and share.
It's time we get celebrated for a country that was so committed to continuing its culture rather than just telling the story of its culture.
Right. In so many temple sculptures, right? In Khajuraho, in Konark, in other parts of Orissa as well, the women that are depicted are so voluptuous and so sensual. We were clearly a culture that celebrated this. What changed in the last, say, 2 or 3 centuries where all of this kind of sensuality and eroticism just seems to have been pulled down and there is a sense of shame that suddenly has come in? What happened? What changed?
This is also something that I think about all the time. When did morality kick in, and who defined the precincts and the precepts of morality in a way that you can dress this way or you cannot dress this way? I mean, I think we as women have heard endlessly, this is not Indian culture.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And whenever I do hear that, I feel like taking them to any temple that has a lot of sculptural, and not just Khajuraho and Konark, but any museum where goddesses are shown, they're not wearing a blouse. At what point did they start wearing a blouse? And the concept of, yes, women were celebrated for their sensuality, but I think it was normal. If you look at Indian women, we are full bodied, voluptuous, warm blooded women. We have big hips, we have voluptuous features, and the range and the different kind of women and the different kinds of communities that exist from the northernmost part of India, from Kashmir. If you go into the northeast, they look very different. When you come down south, they look very different. When you go all the way to the west, very different. So we have all kinds of women, but all over, women were celebrated for their fertility in a great way. You have so many goddesses that women go and pray to for fertility. And I think this sense of morality came in when a lot of interminglings of culture happened, and when there was rather a lack of understanding of the depth of women and the role they play not only in religious rights but also in social and cultural rights. I think towards the latter half, I think I also go back to this anecdote of Japan that I often tell. In Japan, you have these southern islands called Okinawa, and Okinawa is dotted just like how Lakshadweep is dotted all around. And the women over there used to be the primary pearl finders. They used to go pearl fishing and dive. And Okinawa also became the place where the American army base was set up. Up till the American army base was set up there, none of the women wore the top half of their swimming costume. But as soon as the American army base came, they started wearing the top half of their swimming costume. And I'm not playing the blame game here. I'm just saying when two extremely different cultures come into contact, some confusion is normal, no? But having said that, I'm not going to outright say that women were always roaming around naked. We don't know that. We don't know that. What we do know is in text and in material culture, and we do notice that in earlier temples, or even up till later temples, late medieval temples, you did notice that women were shown in the nude, whereas they were wearing the lower garment. They were wearing the lower garment in many places. They were also wearing all the markers of jewelry that a woman is supposed to wear, from the tiara to the arm band to the waistband to the anklets, everything, bangles, rings. They were wearing that. So it's not as if there was a lack of resources that they did not cover themselves up, but it was something where it was normal.
Representation of women in the ancient world, in our ancient past, we also see that in our temples, right? The way that they've been sculpted, the way that they have been represented and shown. But I also want to talk about the sculptors themselves, because whenever I'm looking at one of these monuments, I do think about what was it about our Indian sculptors that made them do the phenomenal work that they've done? Was it that they all believed in the deity whose temple they were sculpting? Was it just tradition, or was it only practice?
Who guided them? Well, again, it's time to celebrate the very, very rich prescriptive literature that came out. Shiva in Kashmir and Shiva in Tamil Nadu may look different in form, but in composition and their chief characteristics that we can identify that this is this form of Shiva, or this avatar of Vishnu, or this time period, or this junction in which Ganesha was dancing. Why we can do that is because of this rich prescriptive literature that was guiding the sculptors how to make the sculpture. What is also most important, that these practices were very deeply ritualized. When the main deity of a religious structure or a temple was made, the last feature that was carved into that sculpture were the eyes. Why? Because the eyes are the most important connection for the worshipper. What do we go to the temples for? To do darshan. What do we do it with? Our eyes. How do we do it? Yes, we bow and prostrate ourselves in front of the god, but we look directly into the eyes of the god. When we go to current living temples, you'll see the deity is completely covered in good clothing, good flowers. Now, the ritual that goes, when the Pandit goes in the morning and opens the temple, first they bathe the sculptor, then they dress the sculpture, then they feed the sculpture. Only when bhog is over, or feeding off the deity is over, then you can worship the sculpture. Now, the sculpture is completely covered in flowers and garments, but the eyes are visible, because it is through the eyes that you will make a connection with the deity. No matter what the gender, what kind of deity it is, you will, right? So we must celebrate the intellectual tradition that propagated a huge scribal culture. There is a guru, And then there are scribes, and they are writing these texts, and they're writing copies and copies and copies of these texts. So when the king comes about, he's like, okay, I want to build my capital. I want to build a huge temple complex. I want to build an economic site around it. I want this community to settle here, this community, because in India, we had community professions, right? You had craftspeople, you had merchants and traders, you had warriors, you had scribes and writers, you had poets, you had all kinds, and these were hereditary traditions, right? So those communities also, by the way, if we celebrate these communities, right, we will understand that up till the end of the Mughal period, India was one of the richest lands. Why were we paying such a huge tribute to the Achaemenid Empire? Even when we were the farthest most area that they engaged with, we're not even saying a colony or whatever, but they engaged. Why were we sending such a huge tribute? Because we had a lot. And why did we have a lot? Because our communities were segregated in that way. Now, coming back to building culture, prescriptive texts by scribes, and then the guilds that were building such buildings were so rich and were trained so well that that entire building culture even informed most of Southeast Asia. When you go to Southeast Asia and you look at Angkor Wat, what is Angkor Wat? The largest, it's only the largest temple in the world. But why does it look so Indian? And who was worshipped inside? Vishnu was worshipped inside. Then it became a Buddhist temple. Then it became a Vishnu temple again. Where are these gods coming from? They're coming from India. Why were they brought into Cambodia? Did India invade Cambodia and set up? No, they were invited. And why were they invited? Because we knew how to build. Buddhism was invited into Japan for its building program and its writing program. It is because of the scribes that informed the craftspeople, that informed the builders, the sculptors, how to build, how to bless a piece of land, how to dig at a piece of land, how to get what stone and build this complex, how to put what sculpture where. Why should Ganesha be at a particular point of that temple? Because it informs you that you must start your circumambulation or going around that structure here. You must put this shoulder against this wall and go around it and then go inside the temple. Why does the temple outside look so rich? But when you go to the inner sanctum, the innermost sanctum, it looks most austere, as if nobody paid attention to it. Why? All of these things are in our prescriptive texts that inform you according to the region, according to the belief, according to the priorities of the patron or the king or the queen of the time, and according to the needs of the people at the time. If people were highly agrarian and they needed rain, there were rain-making rituals that were most popular in Southeast Asia, and the main reason why Indian priests were invited into Southeast Asia to control the rain. Irrigation that goes from the temple complex across the city was also prescribed. If you go to Cambodia even now, during the rainy season, the colonial part of the city will be totally flooded. I have walked knee deep in that water. But if you go to the Siem Reap part of it, where the Angkor temple complex is, pin dry. Why? Because the irrigation plan and the water management plan that was planned in the early 12th century, 10th to 12th century, still works. Still works. It's fascinating as to how simply they understood the natural environment, they understood the needs of the people and the type of land they were living in so well that when they manipulated it, it was out of absolute respect. Similarly, coming back to the temple building or the sculpting tradition of India, the variety of sculptures that you find in India, one lifetime of studying Indian iconography is not enough. You can choose a stream. You want to study Buddhism, you want to study Shaivism, you want to study Shakta, you want to study Jainism, you want to study Vaishnavism. What do you want to study? And then you devote an entire lifetime and you still will not be done with that study. So, yes, I think what was informing is that prescriptive literature,
Which is that historical place in India that fascinates you the most? Could be any reason.
Oh my God. Okay. And you ask me these questions where I just don't have a simple answer. um, the historical region that fascinates me, I have a favorite in North, South, East, West, Center.
Okay, tell me a
Okay. In the northern part, Kashmir fascinates me greatly because of the international influence that Kashmir constantly received from the earliest time period till even now. Right? If you go to the Sun Temple, the Martin Temple there, and you look at the Greco Roman pillars over there, it is just unbelievable as to how Greek they look, but how deeply Indian they are. If you go to Dholavira, it fascinates me that in the middle of a salt desert where not a single plant could grow and my feet got chapped in less than 30 minutes, it is even tough for human survival. How did a city exist and make food, water, transport in 2000 BCE? How did they do that? If I go to the east and I look at Tara Peeth and the history of the goddess Tara and her Buddhist origins and a Hindu assimilation and the power she commands right now and the role that she continues to play till today and how flexible these gods are in accepting and inviting people to worship them. There's no conversion to a lot of aspects of Hindu culture. You cannot really convert. You can get initiated to become a certain grade of practitioner, but you never need to. Anyone can be a Hindu, right? So that's there in the East. In the South, I am absolutely fascinated by Mahabalipuram, by Hampi to a great extent, from Kishkinda to Hampi to the modern Hampi Arts Lab that is just opened over there. This patronage, this indulgence, this absolute homage that we as a society pay to our culture is very powerful. It unites us all in some way. We are very respectful of the past. We imbibe the past in us. We are the past.
As an archaeologist, when you are unearthing fragments from our past and you know through your research and your studies that this is going to help to join some dots, what are you?
How does it feel? Unmatched. I think it would be same for anyone in any profession. When you reach the goal that you have to reach, or when you find the clue to unlocking something big, that feeling is surreal. It's visceral. It cannot be described. So I feel that. Even, these days I am face deep into Megasthenes Indica. And I'm reading about the country told from the perspective of the Greeks. And then I recently finished reading a portion of Al-Biruni's India, telling a story about India through the Islamic perspective when Al-Biruni came to India and studied, Sanskrit, studied Prakrit, Brahmi, like really got deep. He's one of the first Indologists of the country, right? And when I'm even reading these texts and I find out something absolutely fascinating about the country and go into this wormhole of, trying to find out and uncover something just from what's written out there. And then I actually go onto the site. Oh my God, it is a transcendental experience because you are just taken aback by how much we have achieved in this land and how much this land is given to us to get where we are right now. As an archaeologist, I do believe it's a very slow journey to any kind of celebration. Your job is never complete because the history is too rich. Time period and the dust has settled down what we need to find quite deep into the layers of the earth. So you have to really dig deep, to find the ruins that will complete the story.
And also must come with a great sense of responsibility, right? Like when you're on the forefront of something that is going to change how we understand history, that must weigh on you as well, right? That you have
Yes.
to get it.
Absolutely. I think in today's time period, in today's culture, one needs to be even more responsible because your words can be misinterpreted in so many different ways that you have to be very careful. And yes, you owe a responsibility towards society because you're telling what happened in the past. But you're not telling, at least I can speak for myself, I'm not telling anything that may have happened in the past to change the way we are functioning right now. I am telling what happened in the past to acknowledge the way we are right now. Uh, there is no sense of rectification that we need to do, but there is a sense of acceptance and indulgence into the rich variety of our history. You know, women have played a big role, children have played a big role, ecology has played a big role, foreign powers have played a big role. So in that sense, the responsibility of anyone who works with history right now is you have to be very careful. You have to be very mindful. You have to be very inclusive of various facts that maybe you are not trained to think about, but you have to be accepting towards including them, and with humility, to a great extent. Yeah.
What is it like being a woman working in the field of culture?
Working in culture as a woman, we have a little bit of an advantage, I think. Women naturally attuned to being mothers have very high emotional awareness and emotional intelligence. And in a field like culture that is so layered, where sensitivity is the most important thing, women just naturally tend to do really well and tend to think about things in a very interesting way. Um, Having worked in this field since I think 2008 up till now, consistently across the board, whether it is working with a government agency or working with a think tank in a bank or working with a huge international organization or running your own project as well. I think the challenges are in putting yourself out there in a way that sometimes is not taken so seriously. However, when you back it up with scholarship, determination, and a very clear voice, then the advantage comes out in a very beautiful way. So I think I urge, and I continue to do that till today, the field of culture for a country like India needs a lot of experts, whether it's academic experts, scholarly experts, or scientific experts. For example, in archaeology alone, you need people who are botanists, you need zoologists, you need anthropologists, you need gemologists, you need geologists to such a great extent. You need scientists to be working in the field of culture. If you're working in the field of art, yes, you need the skills of fine art, but you also need the emotional awareness and the depth to appreciate and build connoisseurship. The field of culture in terms of literature in India is so, so, so rich that you need people who are experts of languages, people who are fantastic scribes who can recopy the texts that are rotting away. We will, all of this, if it doesn't get not just digitized, but redone, retranslated, retransliterated is something
Right.
that is written in Sanskrit. You can write it in Hindi with the same pronunciation. Something that is written in Pali or Prakrit or Brahmi, they require rigorous translation and constant scholarly engagement. Now, coming back to the role of women in this, I think once you look at scholarship, gender goes out of the door. You just need determination and dedication. The emotional intelligence and the vantage point that women bring to any profession or even in the field of culture should be acknowledged and used and harnessed in the right way. But yes, when you do go out in the field as a female, I do feel sometimes more scared when I'm in the rural hinterlands. And it's also that warning, that constant warning that has so deeply been ingrained into us,
All of us,
in
yeah.
all of us, that comes in the way of our own adventure, so in some ways it's difficult. Also, the infrastructure for women is different. When you're at an archaeological site, and you need to use the bathroom, and it is the time of month, you don't have the infrastructure to kind of really be, the sanitary infrastructure is not there.
Yeah.
And that can be sort of troubling for some girls. But I gotta commend women. They just handle it.
Yeah.
They just handle it. I don't hear enough women complaining about these things as much as just braving it.
If our past could speak to us, what do you think it would say? Is there anything we're forgetting? Is there anything we're leaving behind that we shouldn't? What would it say to us?
Of the many things it would say to us, I think as of today, it would tell us to slow down. The geography of India has seen empires come and go, have seen societies, communities, and civilizations take a lot and give back a lot to the land as well. But now this land seems to be speaking to us directly. If you look at things historically and archaeologically as well, what was happening in the Harappan civilization on the Indian shores, especially around Gujarat, around parts of Rajasthan, around the Run of Kutch, for example, a very tough landscape to build an entire proto-ancient civilization in. I bet the land would have also given them some trouble. Historically, rivers changing courses is a normal thing. The flooding of the Ganges has ruined certain cities at multiple points in time, forcing them to move from one place to the other. Nature speaks to you directly. And a lot of those things back in the past would have been normal ecological cycles. But what we are witnessing right now is nature speaking to us and telling us to stop. I don't know if we do remember that during lockdown, when we looked up at the sky and we heard the sounds of nature, it was awfully loud. The light was so clear and so bright that all of us were a bit stunned, not only at the exhilarating beauty, but overwhelmed as to what have we done here,
But we've gone right back to doing it again.
Of course, we've gone back because society and current culture will not let us exist if we don't get back into the same cycle of what we are doing.
Yeah.
We need money for subsistence. We need to make a lot of money to be able to sustain other people's subsistence. A one-word, two-word answer to your question: slow down right now so that you can rejuvenate and move forward in a more equitable way.
As this super passionate person that I see in front of me, right? What is it that motivates you to do what you do? And where do you want it to lead? Do you have an idea of that?
I don't know where it comes from. I don't know why I am so passionate. I live, breathe, eat culture, Indian culture. Call me an army officer's daughter, as a deeply patriotic person who loves her country. And you know what? I've had the same dreams as a lot of people. Let's go abroad and study, maybe settle abroad. And I remember, and I've done that. I've studied in England. I spent enough time in America. I've studied in Japan. I really was so fortunate and privileged to have those experiences. But I, at some point, knew that the only place that I will live and breathe is in India. And I absolutely love this country for something so rich in this country. It's so alive, it's thriving. I think you and I were having this conversation off the record about the continuous culture.
Right.
And a lot of clues to our very ancient past might be in our kitchens right now, might be something that we have been trained to do over and over again a certain way,
Right.
that makes this land so absolutely inspiring, and it is a culture that is still living. And I think I say this with much pride. A very, very ancient system was developed here in India, and very ancient systems were developed in different parts of the world. This is the one that continues up till today. It's so rare
Right.
to see that. And it has not only continued, but expanded, influenced, inspired people so deeply that the entire world is fascinated by it. We are sitting at a juncture where everyone is even looking at India right now,
Right.
because from the textiles of India to the working of metal in India, I mean, you have the iron pillar.
Yeah.
It does not rust.
Yeah.
And the engineering of the building programs of India, from the Baulis to the large, temple complexes, to the huge, most ancient universities. I mean, Vikramashila, Nalanda, Takshila, Odantapuri, there were over 18 universities across from the northernmost part of India, going down all the way bottom of Odisha. And these universities were so popular, were so rich in their intellectual fabric, that people from all the way from Japan and Indonesia and Cambodia and China were coming to India. Hyun Sang came to India. Why did he come to India? Did he come to India just as like traveling, just want to see the sights? No. He came to collect manuscripts and texts that they can build their culture through. When he came, he wanted to go to Nalanda. He wanted to go to Vikramashila. He stopped over at Takshila. He retraced the Buddha's steps. The intellectual past of India in these universities was so rich that when people had to come to India, they had to take an entrance exam in Indonesia. There was another university as a subsidiary university that was set up over there, that people had to take a Sanskrit exam so that they could get admission in Nalanda. And when people were coming to India that time, and I'm talking like when these universities were flourishing, they would, embedded through the Indian system of merit making, they would put gold foil all over the walls. Even today, when you go to Sarnath, the Archaeological Survey of India has put a board there. Please do not put gold on this building. Because the Buddhists would come there and put gold to gain merit. It's the same practice as to when you donate a bench to the park and say, in the memory of so and so.
Right.
Every time someone sits on that bench, you gain merit in heaven, and they are maintaining that register of yours, So people used to come to these universities gilded in gold. So imagine all of these universities, what they may have looked like. They had libraries and libraries full of books and texts. Those libraries right now are in parts of monasteries of Tibet, in Nepal, all over in China, so many of them. Now there are certain societies, Buddhist societies in Sarnath, for example, who are recollecting these texts and building those libraries again. I have never watched Lord of the Rings or any of these fantasy films. Not because I don't have a fascination for them, is because my entire day goes in things
Yeah.
about Indian culture that are so fantastical, metaphysically rich. The visualization. I mean, if you just go and look at one sculpture of Durga and start decoding that, that's a few years of your life gone. So I think the passion comes from the country itself. It keeps me on my toes, and I hope I never lose this drive.
Like you said, many lifetimes.
Many lifetimes.
Say a few centuries from now, right? There are some archaeologists who are looking at our era, at our lives and times. They happen to come across something about you. What would they find about your life?
I think they would find, first of all, my library. that is the codex to where my thoughts are, because I'll buy books of what I'm interested in. They will find copious notes in them, terribly written. If a librarian ever went into my books and saw, I have no manners. I will write with a ball pen, ink pen, pencil. I will underline, I will do, and I leave it there because it gives me references when I come back to. So they'll find that. They'll be a little confused as to why this person is so into the past, but also so into the future, because I love contemporary art. I've curated some shows in contemporary art as well. And I think it is to build connoisseurship for people to engage with culture. I'm just obsessed with bringing everyone into this world where I'm just like, celebrate yourself. This is you. This is part of you, you know? Um, and I think they will be a little intrigued about my obsessiveness about people's private spaces, whether archaeological sites or people's homes or anything.
So, moving from our ancient past and our ancient history to a more recent time, um, during British rule, we saw so many women at the forefront, just kind of fighting out there, shoulder to shoulder. And it was just 100 years ago, right? What can we learn from these women?
Strength and power, they're just continuing something that always existed in India. Women have played a very important role in society. Our houses are led by the matriarchs of the house, no matter how patriarchal region it may be, but the women are absolutely important. What can we learn about them besides strength is resilience. Our bodies don't do us much of a favor. We naturally have so many processes going on inside of us. Our metaphysical cosmologies that acknowledge the goddess and females in that way have accounted for that as well. But over time, it has been resilience. But when we look at the time when the entire country united against a common enemy, that entire country included its women so powerfully. And for that, I'm very proud. During the independence struggle, these women were walking foot by foot. And some of my favorite videos to watch on YouTube are of these women like Sarojini Naidu talking so eloquently, and in current politics also, you see the participation of women. I mean, these women, they talk in such a fiery manner and they cannot go unheard. So I think it is resilience, dedication, loyalty, responsibility. And no matter what they say, you stand your ground, is what I take not only from the women from our independence struggle, but also from the goddesses from the Chaucer Yogini temples.
If we look back at history, and you can go to any part of history, and if I were to ask you again for that one thing, the one woman that inspires you, that you would want to talk about, that you would want to embody, who would that be?
One woman who has fascinated me greatly, because I look at a little bit into my roots as well, the area that my father's family comes from. And this happened on a drive. I was going on a road trip. I was going with my dad. And he told me, and we were just outside Delhi, driving towards the hills via Meerut. And while we were driving along the Upper Ganga Canal, which had newly been, made with good roads, he said, not too far from here, there is a beautiful church. And in that church, and I went to a convent school in Missouri, so churches were not so fantastic to me. It was very normalized because from a very early age, mass is happening all the time. It was very normal. But when he said that, there's like, in that church, sculptors were called from Italy and Rome from Italy in Rome to make an entire Christian capital of the country. And this lady was actually from Chandni Chowk, but she became this. She was Muslim, and then she married this kind of a company person. He was actually a mercenary. He was not a Britisher or anything, but a company person, a mercenary who was rather grumpy, and that's why he was given the name Somber. And he got fascinated by her, who was a Notch girl, married her, and then she became one of the richest people during the East India Company. And then she converted to Christianity. And then when she converted to Christianity, she even got legitimization from the Vatican. And the sculpture of her is there and her grave is there. And I went to a CJM. He said, and you know what? Right next to the church is a CJM as well. I never went to that chapel or that church with my dad. But a few years ago, I was on that same road and I was thinking about him. And I just took my car to that place. And it came to me that, wow, he was right. I was ushered in this small town called Sardana, just around Meerut, into this what felt like Rome.
Wow.
Beautiful, massive marble sculptures of the saints and gods leading up this walkway. I mean, they were opulent, they were beautifully sculpted. Gorgeous gardens and this beautiful church up front, huge church up front. And when you went inside, I saw the most magical scene. This lady, whose name was Begum Samru, who had an army that she supplied either to the British or against the British as well, controlled an armed force of over 50,000 Jat soldiers. And this is a very, very interesting group of people, a community of people.
So this was a private army that she ran.
Yes,
Wow. Okay.
a private army that she ran. And Jat soldiers, Jats are a favorite in the military even now. Strong men, bold men and women. And you go to Haryana, you look at the women also, they're like well built. Best sportsmen of our country come from there. And she was 4 feet nothing in height. When she was young, she was considered to be very, very beautiful. But as she got older and the stresses of running a kingdom came upon her, she didn't age so well. She was rather the opposite of what she was in her youth. She rode a horse. She dressed like an absolute queen. She wore a hat and all of that. And she held on to her money like anything. And she was one of the richest. And she's been portrayed in a few films and documentaries that have been done very fleetingly. And I hope someday someone picks up her because she's so fascinating. So I came upon her sculpture and she sat on a high chair right on top like a regal lady with all the garments. In India, if you're royal, you just have textiles and textiles and textiles upon you, gilded in gold, right? So she sat there on a high chair, and there were priests and priestesses, common people, a lady in a sari, all in marble. Such beautiful sculptures. And I was mesmerized. And that church was stunning. And you saw the letter from the Vatican and everything. And the strength and resilience of this woman, her passion, I somehow kind of identified with her. Here is a woman who was Islamic and then converted to Christianity and then embraced it, and how, and ran a Christian kingdom. In Chandni Chowk, Bhagirath Palace, there is still her Begum Samru ki Haveli, which later on became Lloyd's Bank. And when you go there, you see the Greco-Roman pillars. You see the big French shutters over there, still there. And it's become like a chawl inside. And you can't blame Chandni Chowk. Chandni Chowk is one of our oldest living bustling metropolises that is not for the light-hearted.
And I think this was given to her by the Mughal emperor himself, right? Shah Alam II.
Yes. So, and thanks to her service to him, she saved his life. But Begum Samru was and will always remain a lady who fascinates me incredibly. I look up to everything that she sort of did and managed. What strength. Yeah.
Have you ever wondered what it might be like to embody her?
Every day.
Are you okay if we dress you up as her?
Oh my God, that's going to be fun. Sure.
Because as you know, that's what we do at the end of this podcast.
Just come
right?
in me.
Yeah, so you're ready for that?
I'm ready.
Okay, we'll do our best.
I'd read about her and remember thinking, what an interesting woman. For this look, I wanted to recreate not only the style, but also the light and interiors. It's interesting that though she converted to Christianity, she continued to dress as a Muslim woman of her time. The jhumar is very characteristic, of course, and for the hat, I took a beret and converted it to something that Begum Samru would have worn. I added an embroidered shawl and a long kurta and gave her a multi-strand pearl choker and lots of rings and bracelets. By adding a velvet curtain and painted backdrop, and of course that old hookah, Anika's look as Begum Samru was absolutely ready.
Anika, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. This has to be the first of a few others, and there are several other, passions and parts of your life that I would love to unpack, but we'll have to save that for another time. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.